Hi, this is Dr. Lynn Patrick. I'm doing an introduction for Bob Miller, who is going to present this webinar. He is representing Nutrigenetic Research Institute and Functional Genomic Analysis, of course, which he is the founder of. Highly intelligent human being. He's going to be talking about NADPH and NAD and NADPH oxidase. I want to set the context here for you. As you know, NOX is a really big deal right now in research, specifically in neurodegenerative diseases, and specifically in Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, Huntington's disease, multiple sclerosis, ALS, and acute CNS disorders like stroke and spinal cord injury, as well as traumatic brain injury and cerebrovascular disease. So NOX, NADPH, oxidase, enzyme, right? So we need to put that in the context of superoxide, which is the free radical that is produced by NOX, which is found in white blood cells, but can also be found in multiple other cells in the CNS and regulates all kinds of signaling, memory processing, and cardiovascular homeostasis. So very, very important enzyme. So enjoy. I certainly did. It sparked a lot of things in my brain. I had 5,000 questions for Bob when he was finished. Of course, I didn't have time to ask him all of them, but we will in 2021 when we bring him back for another lecture at the podium. So enjoy.
Well, Lynn, thank you for the opportunity to present this, because I believe that the information we're going to give today might be very critical for those who are looking to help individuals detox from environmental toxins. As you see on the title slide here, it says how overexpression of the NOX enzyme is creating what I've called the NADPH steal. That's a term that I just came up with a little over a year ago. And the more I continue to do the work in analyzing people's genomes and what's happening, the more I believe that this has to be looked at very, very seriously. Now, in the previous webinar that we did, we focused on the function and the purpose of NAD plus and NADPH. So I'm just going to do an incredibly quick review. And then I would encourage you, if you want to learn more about this, listen to the webinar number 1 that we did. So quick review in case you missed it or just to hear it again. NAD is involved in redox reactions and carries electrons from one reaction to another. As you know, we are, one big bag of electrons that are transferring back and forth. Now, there's 2 forms in the cells. NAD plus is an oxidizing agent because it accepts the electrons and becomes reduced. And this forms NADH, which can then be used as a reducing agent to donate electrons. And of course, you all remember from studying the electron transport that NADPH is at the very top that creates your ATP. And these electron transfer reactions are the main function of NAD. And of course, I'm sure you're hearing lots of discussion. From the folks from Harvard are talking about the benefits of NAD and how it's involved in longevity. It's also used in other cellular processes, mostly notable as substrate of enzymes that add or remove chemical groups from proteins. And then because of the importance of these functions, the enzymes involved in NAD metabolism have a critical role in maintaining homeostasis. Now let's look at some of the things that it does. Energy metabolism, mitochondrial functions, calcium homeostasis. This next key point is very important because it's involved with antioxidants, because it helps take your oxidized antioxidants back to reduced. But you'll notice it says generation of oxidative stress, the complete opposite. That's going to be our focus today, talking about how NADPH can be critical in antioxidants, but when needed, creates oxidative stress. And we're going to get into that in a little bit and tell you why I believe that the overexpression of it in the oxidative stress is occurring due to environmental toxins. It's also involved in gene expression, immunological functions, and of course right now with all the concerns, that's critical, slowing down the aging process and is involved in cellular death. Now, NAD mediates energy metabolism and mitochondrial functions. NADPH, as we just said, and that's why I have it in here twice, it's a key component in cellular antioxidant systems. It takes that oxidized antioxidant, turns it back to reduced. But it's also involved in reactive oxygen species generation. What an interesting concept, that this same molecule will protect us, but will also create a burst of free radicals. We'll be getting into that. Now, first, quick review. And again, we're just covering in a few minutes what we spent over an hour on in the last webinar. Nitric oxide, critical. We need nitric oxide for circulation, but as Nathan Bryan and others are pointing out, it has many more functions. So one of the cofactors for the production of nitric oxide, along with BH4, oxygen, and arginine, is NADPH to make your nitric oxide. Without enough NADPH, we have inadequate nitric oxide. Okay. The thiodoxin, we don't talk about that very much, but it is involved in clearing hydrogen peroxide, an incredibly important antioxidant. NADPH recycles the oxidized back to the reduced. Of course, everyone knows about glutathione. So when glutathione does its job, it turns into oxidized glutathione. We need NADPH to take it back to reduced. And interestingly, I'm sure many of these practitioners listening to this have, given someone glutathione, either supplementary or intravenously, and the person got worse. And that can make you think a little bit, how could giving someone the powerful antioxidant that the lower it goes, the sicker we are and the sooner we're going to die, make you worse? Well, what we've concluded, if you give glutathione and it gets stuck in oxidized, and we may show a chart on that later, it will combine with oxygen to make superoxide and then nitric oxide to make peroxynitrite, the oxidizing agent that suppresses the immune system. So ironically, without enough NADPH, administering glutathione under some circumstances can have contraindicated effects. As we put our heme into ferritin, we need one of the phase 1 CYPs, but also NADPH. To put your heme into biliverdin, you need NADPH. And also to create your carbon monoxide, interestingly, that stimulates NRF2, KEAP1, and DNA repair enzymes. So NADPH, as I look at it, it's so critical for our use. Again, go back to the previous webinar where we taught you all the pathways that it's made and how to support it. However, NADPH oxidase, or NOX, I find this fascinating. The only known enzyme family with the sole function to produce reactive oxygen species. Let me read that again. Its sole function is to produce reactive oxygen species. Now, this is involved in host defense, cellular signaling, regulation of gene expression, and cell differentiation. Now, we many times think that, free radicals are bad, antioxidants are good. However, we wouldn't live without free radicals, because when we're faced with a virus or a bacteria, NADPH oxidase comes to the rescue, and it stimulates the mast cells, and that creates histamine and cytokines. It creates a huge storm to kill the pathogens. If we didn't have that, we'd die of infection. However, the NOX enzyme utilizes NADPH and oxygen to create that reactive oxygen species. Is this a good thing? Of course. As I said, without it, we'd die of infection. But the key point here is balance. And I'm going to make an argument, as we did the research and combed through the literature, that there's a very high probability that environmental toxins that we weren't exposed to in the past or at as high levels are overstimulating the NOX enzyme. And we're going to spend the rest of the webinar talking about that. So increased NOX activity is involved in cardiovascular disease, neurodegeneration, organ failure, cancer, and autism. If you had listened to any of the lectures by Dr. Theohardis from Tufts University, he believes one of the causes, or possibly main cause, of autism is the mast cells overstimulating the hypothalamus. So this is a published study. It's saying, therefore, targeting these enzymes, these enzymatic reactive oxygen species sources with natural compounds without affecting the redox state may be an important tool. Now, this is an important chart, and perhaps we can include this as a PDF with this webinar. So this is a chart the Nutrigenetic Research Institute made, and here it shows the NOX enzyme, and when it's stimulated, it will create superoxide to stimulate the mast cells. Again, good thing when we're faced with a virus or bacteria. Just as a quick side note, nitric oxide and oxytocin have a modulating effect on this. HMOX, heme oxygenase, that we'll talk about a little bit, has a calming effect on the mast cells. And the KIT genes are what trigger the mast cells. And there's some of them, when they're mutated, actually are overactive. And when I talk to clients, I talk about that if you think of the mast cells as the police officers or the army, got to have them, but you don't want them to be trigger happy. You don't want the police officer in town to be starting to shoot when the leaves rustle, or it thinks he sees a shadow. You want those shots to be targeted and at the right enemy. Now, we're going to review this, but low frequency EMF, sulfites, dopamine, homocysteine, aldosterone, which can also be aggravated by stress, smoking or any air pollution, glutamate, that I'm a huge fan of and see that all the time, that excess glutamate is causing problems for us. Iron actually donates the oxygen to combine with the NADPH to make the superoxide. Now, in our next webinar that you want to make sure you listen to, we'll be spending a whole hour, or about an hour, on how iron can become dysregulated. Oxalates becoming a huge problem. As you know, if you eat too much spinach, kale, and beets and some of those high oxalate foods, and you have a leaky gut, those oxalates can come in. And that's why I'm a big fan of the Great Plains urine organic acid, because it'll tell you if you have oxalates. Histamine, and I believe histamine is just out of control. And mTOR, mammalian target of rapamycin, which is the inverse to autophagy. Nobel Prize in Medicine 2016 was on autophagy. And autophagy is the cleaning of the cells, making those autophagosomes that will envelop pathogens, but also recycle your dead cells. And that's why people will get those age spots, sunspots, liver spots, when autophagy is not as robust as it should. Mycotoxins. Oh my goodness. I think this is becoming a serious, serious problem. Our fall conference in September is going to be 3 days on mycotoxins. Again, EMF, allergens, diesel exhaust, xenobiotics, some of the Lyme pathogens will all stimulate the mast cells. And that's why in Lyme disease, when someone has the Lyme and the mycotoxins, it's a double whammy. Then those mast cells make histamine. So we just showed you earlier the importance of NADPH, how it's involved in so many functions. So in our huge map that we give to people, we have all those functions over here. However, when the NOX enzyme needs to make this free radical, it steals NADPH from doing all those other important functions to provide the electron needed to make the superoxide. So, is this a good thing? Yes, when it's needed, when you've got a foreign invader. Is there a problem if epigenetic and genetic factors are stimulating this excessively? That's the whole crux of this conversation. Clearly, more research needs to be done. But in our consulting work here, we continually see this pattern of something upregulating NOX. Now, if you add to that someone who might have some genetic factors that slows the production of NADPH, and that's what we typically see in our consulting work, something that's stimulating NOX, calling for more NADPH, and then genetic mutations that would impair the production of NADPH, the proverbial perfect storm. Now, this is expanded a little bit to show you that those mast cells create histamine. Now, you all know that we need the ABP1 enzyme to break down histamine. To save space, we took it off here, but the HNMT, histamine and methyltransferase, takes that off. And then also there is a process through glucuronidation that removes histamine. So what's the perfect storm? Overproduction of mast cells, overproduction of histamine, weakness in any of your histamine clearing. So what do we have to do? We have to have cortisol to calm down that histamine. Of course, you all know that comes from the adrenals. Adrenal fatigue. I mean, it's rampant. In our bigger chart, we have the hypothalamus over here, and we can attach that larger chart as a PDF if you'd like. Then the mast cells also make cytokines. And here's our latest research that we'll be talking about at our next conference. IL-13, interleukin 13, and IL-4. You don't hear many people talking about this. For quite a while, we have observed that those who are really, really struggling had something that would cause mast cells and a lot of genetic mutations on IL-13, interleukin 13. We could do a whole webinar on IL-13, but we're still researching. When there are mutations in IL-13, it's an upregulation and more function, so it comes back and stimulates more mast cells. Whoa, this is, we believe, incredibly significant. Preliminary research is showing that vitamin D helps calm this down, and so does cortisol. We are very soon going to be doing our online certification course where we will have eventually a modular 2 on IL-13. So for those of you who do functional genomic testing, keep an eye on this IL-13. And although I'm not talking about in this webinar, we've also identified the CYPs that are involved in progesterone to cortisol. People who have those oftentimes get what that's called pregnenolone steal, where pregnenolone is called over to desperately make progesterone to make more cortisol. And of course, you all know cortisol turns into cortisone. We want to try to map all that out for you as well. So the perfect storm is when one of these down here causes NOX to be overactive. Perhaps you've got some KIT variants that it overreacts. You might have some weakness in HMOX that calms it down. If you've got low nitric oxide or oxytocin, you don't have that modulating effect. Then you're creating all that histamine. And if you have any weakness in any of the histamine degradation pathways, you have the perfect storm. And the people have adrenal fatigue, all kinds of histamine reactions, massive inflammation throughout the body. The histamine drives glutamate, and then the glutamate makes you anxious. So this is your typically wired, tired, anxious, and depressed. And I'm sure as practitioners, you see many, many people. Just a clinical observation, that's all. Bob Miller, traditional naturopath, observing. Many, many, many of the people who are struggling that can't seem to get answers, something in here is causing it. And there isn't one thing. That's what makes it so complex. You know, when people are looking for the SNP, I don't think we're ever going to find it because it's a dance between multiple SNPs, multiple environmental insults combining together. That's why our last conference was called the 3D chess game played underwater. All right, let's take a look. I'm not going to read all these. You can download the slides, but the bottom line is here is that homocysteine is one of the stimulants to the NOX enzyme. So bottom line, homocysteine stimulated superoxide in the vascular wall is mediated through the activation of NADPH oxidase, which leads to the endothelial dysfunction. So that's why the higher the homocysteine, the sicker you are from all causes. I'm not going to say this is the only mechanism that homocysteine can be damaging, but certainly is one of them. The ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme. Variance in RS4343 is an upregulation and leads to higher levels of angiotensin 2, which leads to more aldosterone. Luteolin, olive leaf, and apigenin may support that. Sulfites. Now, if any of you listen to my good friend Stephanie Seneff, by the way, she's going to be presenting brand new research on glyphosate and how it may be impacting mycotoxins at the fall conference. Sulfites is generated as a consequence of the body's normal processing of sulfur-containing amino acids. Any of you listened to Stephanie Seneff's talks or even some of her YouTube videos, she talks about how she's very convinced that glyphosate is impacting the heme pathway, where we take succinyl CoA and glycine to make our heme. And if that's being disrupted because glyphosate is impacting the glycine receptor sites, what you're going to have happen then is you don't have enough heme, and heme is a cofactor for sulfite to sulfate conversion. Okay, and sulfites, of course, also are in fermentation, and that SUOX enzyme converts the sulfites to sulfates. But in addition to molybdenum, heme is a cofactor. So if we do not have enough heme, sulfites don't turn into sulfates. So sulfites stimulate NOX. And as you know, sulfation is a very important phase 2 detox pathway. And one of the things it clears is the catecholamines. Well, guess what happens if we don't clear the catecholamines? Boom, we've got more stimulation of the NOX enzyme. That's why I'm calling this the 3D chess game. Okay, so some analysis shown that low concentrations of sulfites stimulates the superoxide anions by the NADPH oxidase enzyme. Okay, and then that can create sulfide peroxyl and sulfate radicals. They're highly reactive and contribute to increased oxidative stress, which may lead to sulfite toxicity, which can affect all kinds of problems. And look, the intestinal lymphocytes. I mean, it's scary how inflammatory bowel disease is increasing among children, and how colon cancer is now happening in the younger generations that used to only happen later on. Here is a chart, and again, we'll attach the entire chart to this talk. But here you can see that here's your homocysteine coming down through into cysteine. Here's your CBS enzyme. As you can see here, the homocysteine will stimulate the NOX enzyme. Sulfites will stimulate the NOX enzyme. Here's SUOX, and you can see here that says SUOX is heme dependent and molybdenum. We need that for sulfites to sulfates to make your PAPs, which then the SALT enzyme uses to take out your catecholamines, hormones, antibiotics, and toxins. If this is not working properly, and I believe a lot of us have this compromised now due to glyphosate or any other factors. By the way, I don't have it on here, but oxidized glutathione will also inhibit the SALT enzyme, which takes you back to NADPH. So if you don't have NADPH and you don't recycle your glutathione, that oxidized glutathione, in addition to creating peroxynitrite, will inhibit salt. And therefore, we don't have that very critical sulfation detox pathway. Histamine. Okay, there's increasing evidence that intercellular reactive oxygen species, and that the NADPH is that source. So we're talking here about how histamine, although that's created by it, will actually come back in a circular loop. Purely speculation, but is this possibly why a child gets strep throat and they turn into pandas? Does this kick off something that just keeps feeding upon itself? Iron. Again, our next webinar is going to be on iron. It's a cofactor in the NADPH-dependent oxidative burst. Iron chelation has been hypothesized to possibly play a role in regulating oxidative stress. I mean, it's well known that the higher levels of iron are behind liver disease, early onset of dementia. So in this study, they're saying altering the equilibrium of intracellular iron could influence oxidative stress. Next webinar, we're going to talk about an enzyme called ferroportin, which is the only iron exporter. Us observing when people have a lot of mutations in ferroportin, they'll many times have low iron because they're turning it into hydroxyl radicals, and lots of inflammation that cannot seem to be resolved. Glutamate. Now, you all know that glutamate converts to GABA. Glutamate's the go-get-em, very intelligent, highly motivated, but it needs to be turned into GABA, the don't worry, relax, be happy. But the glutamate to GABA can be compromised by lead, aluminum, and mercury. And then also infection and or inflammation will inhibit it. Result is that excitotoxicity. And, aside from that, just the autism, I talk to a lot of elementary school teachers and I'll say, how long have you been teaching? And if they're teaching more than 5 years, I'll say to them, how are the children today compared to 5 years ago? I haven't had anyone yet that says the children are more anxious, irritable, difficult to focus, and they all talk among themselves as to what is going on. Clearly, multiple factors. And I wouldn't be, so brazen to say this is it, but this has to be a factor, that environmental factors are likely in creating more glutamate and potentially lowering the glutamate to GABA conversion. So prolonged activation of the glutamate receptors leads to that excitotoxicity. It's been suggested that the ROS producing enzyme NADPH oxidase plays a role in that. And here's the study that shows it. Glutamate, again, researchers evaluated the roles of different glutamate receptor subtypes on NOX activation and the NOX2 immunoreactivity in neurons and microglia was stimulated by glutamate administration. So some evidence that the glutamate does that. By contrast, mice lacking NOX2, which is what stimulates the mast cells, were less vulnerable to excitotoxicity, and there was reduced free radical production. These results suggest that NOX2 is stimulated by glutamate. And again, we just get on the merry-go-round that just keeps going and going. So I'm a big fan of looking at ways to support the glutamate to GABA conversion. And here's a chart, and you'll get this whole chart if you'd like it. Glutamate's interesting because it comes from glutamine, okay, but we need the GLUL gene to take glutamate back to glutamine. So I know a lot of health professionals say to folks, okay, you've got an inflamed gut, let me give you some powders that have glutamine in. Well, that's well and good unless the glutamate's already high and inflammation is inhibiting the glutamate to glutamine conversion. Glutamate has to turn into GABA. Inflammation or infection or heavy metals will inhibit the glutamate to GABA conversion. You also need B6 and magnesium. And of course, it doesn't matter what your SNPs are. You could have perfect GAD, no inflammation or infection. If you don't have B6 and magnesium, that's not going to occur. So that's why SNPs are a piece of the equation, not the whole story. Our good friend NAD is needed to take glutamate to turn it into alpha-ketoglutarate. This is your Krebs cycle, which then becomes your succinyl-CoA, which feeds your heme cycle. And heme is involved in many steps of detoxification. Without heme, you're not going to detox. So there's a lot that can go wrong here. Additionally, the SIRT3, I'm a huge fan of looking at the SIRT3 mutations because if these are mutated or they're also NAD dependent, so if you don't have enough NAD to feed the SIRT3 or you have SIRT3 mutations, you could potentially inhibit your glutamate to alpha-ketoglutarate, this is your Krebs cycle, again putting the glutamate up, leading to that neuroexcitotoxicity. Smoking. NOX activation is created by cigarette smoke. And I think we have to look just beyond cigarette smoke and just all of the air pollution. And, when you look at what's happening in China today, you have to wonder if air pollution is not a contributing factor, not the cause, but a contributing factor to some of the challenges that we're seeing today. Now, I'm also a big fan of dopamine. As many of you may know, Clostridia will inhibit the DBH enzyme to turn dopamine into norepinephrine. And then you can have mutations on dopamine. Bottom line is, dopamine induces NADPH oxidative stress. So, you'll talk to folks and you'll say to them, does the least little thing really tick you off? It's like, oh my God, yeah. There are many reasons for this, but high dopamine can be one of them. And again, Clostridia or mutations in the DBH enzyme can impact that. we're actually working on a supplement that gives the cofactors for the DBH enzyme. So here's just a study that shows that dopamine induced a transient increase in cytoplasmic NOX1 and NOX4, and these are the enzymes that stimulate the mast cells. So as we said, DBH supports dopamine and norepinephrine. Riboflavin 5-phosphate supports. We're going to be updating that with more. Copper is another one. COMT supports the degrading of catecholamines. Variants may keep dopamine high, but let me talk about that a little bit. Some people define themselves as, oh, I have the COMT enzymes, therefore, I shouldn't use methyl groups. I wish that life was so simple, but I'm afraid it's not. That we just can't make these generalizations because there's multiple factors, and I don't have a chart to show this, but estrogen inhibits COMT, testosterone supports it. Quercetin may inhibit COMT. So a lot of people are doing a lot of quercetin for histamine. They might actually be making it worse. And this is an interesting little clinical pearl. Tyramine from things like cheese inhibit the COMT. So I have case studies where a gentleman had migraines and panic attacks because he was eating too many grapes and cheese, inhibiting COMT. Again, 3D chess game. COMT also needs SAMe. So if you have perfect COMT, if your estrogen and testosterone are balanced, if you are not eating a lot of cheese, and you don't have SAMe, that can be as bad or worse than whether you had the variants, which takes me back to we can't totally be defined by the variants. I give the analogy, if you have a perfectly brand new car and you don't have gas, you got a hunk of metal. So if you have a perfectly working COMT and you don't have the cofactors, you're going to be in trouble. So back to the 3D chess game. So how do we inhibit this NADPH oxidase? Again, we don't want to inhibit it totally. We just don't want it to be carried away. Here's a study showing the use of natural antioxidants presents a promising new approach for NOX inhibition. Various polyphenols doing that, particularly luteolin, decreases NADPH oxidase activity in a number of tissues, including vessels and platelets. Spirulina, turmeric. Obviously, we can't take nitric oxide, but help support the production of it. And the HMOX enzyme inhibits NOX. So I'm a big fan of magnolia bark, hinokial. They have been identified as major components exhibiting antioxidative, anti-inflammatory, and neuroprotective effects. Now, how do we modulate NOX? Again, there's no magic pill here. Adequate heme production to support SUOX and antioxidants. Make sure you've got good levels of homocysteine. Healthy SUOX function. That means molybdenum, heme. Healthy histamine. And again, we could do a whole webinar on histamine. By the way, we'll be covering this in our online certification course. Many ways, slow down the production of it, but make sure acetylation, ABP1 is working. If it's not, that's where you do the DAO, histamine and methyltransferase, and one of the glucuronidation pathways, healthy glutamate, healthy iron, particularly if your patient or client is of English-Irish descent. Incredibly common. Oh, and by the way, Ashkenazi Jews, incredibly common to have mutations in the genes that cause overabsorption of iron. Not hemochromatosis, but just overabsorption. Balanced mTOR and autophagy. This could be another whole webinar, but will be covered in our certification course. I believe there's many epigenetic factors that are upregulating mTOR, consequently weakening autophagy. Adequate cortisol to suppress the histamine. So that may mean supporting the hypothalamus, the adrenals, making sure there's adequate progesterone. Also, pantothenic acid, or pantethine rather, is excellent. Make sure the oxalates are doing okay. Huge problem. For some individuals, that's the issue. Reduce exposure to mold and mycotoxins because they stimulate the NOX, and reduce EMF exposure. As I look at people's genomes, for some people, EMF exposure is the big issue. For other people, mold and toxins is the issue. For others, it's oxalates. For others, they've got carrier status for the hemochromatosis genes. For others, they've got the DAO enzyme variants that creates more histamine. Or for some individuals, they don't break down histamine. So all of these factors could be contributing. So there isn't the magic bullet, do this for that. We've got to be serious clinicians, do our homework, and find out what's the agitating factor and take appropriate remedial action. So I'm not going to read all these. You can download the slides, and here's all the things that can go wrong in the heme pathway. Here's everything that can happen, and there's more than this. We'll cover this in the next webinar. Here's what can happen with iron, the NOX enzymes, ABP1, HNMT, MAOA, glutamate, GAD or DAO, sulfites, CBS, CTH, SUOX. Here's the whole methylation pathway, the autophagy pathway. When mutations are here, autophagy can be weakened, therefore mTOR can be activated. And EMF, the calcium voltage channels. As you know, the current thinking on EMF is that the EMF pushes more calcium into the cells. Consequently, that combines with nitric oxide and superoxide to make peroxide nitrate. So it's happening to all of us, but those who have mutations in the calcium voltage channels are more susceptible. So remedies for the NADPH deal, see if there's genetic issues with any of the NAD plus and NADPH pathways. Again, if you are underproducing NADPH, that can be enough to cause a problem. Modulate and calm NOX. Support production and usage of NAD. Support glutamate to GABA conversion if that's the issue. Reduce oxalates if it's an issue. Support proper use of iron if it's an issue. We should all be limiting EMF exposure, but particularly those who have the calcium voltage channels. Support sulfite to sulfate. Lower homocysteine. Control the dopamine. By the way, just clinical pearl. When I see people who have high dopamine and I ask them, do you get agitated quickly? And they're like, oh my gosh, yes. I tell them I have 4 important words. And those words are, it's not your fault. And the look on their face and their appreciation, it's like, oh, really? Oh my God, thank you. And keep an eye on those 4 words, because many times they get chastised for having a short fuse, and it really may not be their fault. Sometimes if we have a good relationship and they're okay, I'll say, it's the damn dopamine, and they laugh. Adequate NRF2 and GSH activity. NRF2, which we could do a whole webinar on, but covered in the certification course, is the creation, utilization, and recycling of all your antioxidants. So again, if you have poor NRF2 activity, you can have the best glutathione genes in the world, but if NRF2 doesn't signal them to turn on, they're not going to work. So what do we do? We have to make sure that NADPH is not used by an overactive NOX enzyme. Pathways are supported. Now, flexibility in how to push the NAD plus NADPH. Critical point here, because as we're now learning about NAD, there's this, once again, we get on this bandwagon craze, and that is, oh, let's take NAD. Let's take NAD intravenous. Well, that's great, except, and this is a big except, if the NOX enzymes are upregulated and we're making more mast cells. So when you take NAD, which you think is going to be feeding your DNA repair enzymes and helping you recycle, could actually feed inflammation. It's kind of like what we did with methylfolate. We became looking at, oh my gosh, I've got MTHFR, I need methylfolate. Interestingly, we talked about this in the last webinar. If you don't have enough NADPH, methylfolate actually becomes inflammatory. The reason women need methylfolate is because it stimulates mTOR. Well, if you're not pregnant and your mTOR is already upregulated, taking folate or too much folate could actually then create inflammation. I don't know enough about it or make the claim that this is the only pathway, but this could be one of the pathways that excessive or too soon methylfolate could stimulate inflammation. So that old Hippocratic oath, first do no harm. We have to be careful. And I sometimes believe that by looking at the genome, you can help people the most by taking them off things or not putting them on something that may not be appropriate. Just a clinical pearl, I never put people on unless they're pregnant. I don't think it's a good idea to start with methylfolate right out of the gate when there's inflammation going on. Take care of some of these other things. Then in my own consulting work, we'll do a little bit of folate a couple months down the road and 2 or 3 days a week. So I sort of went through this. I'm not going to read all this, but step one, calm specific NOX overstimulation. We went through all that. Interestingly, this is a formula called NADPH Protect, and we're not going to go through the whole thing, but this was designed to calm down all of those pathways. And if you look at the ingredients, you'll see which pathways they're calming down, kind of like a shotgun approach. This could be called NADPH, or it could be called, calm NOX. But this is designed to calm the NOX enzyme. So sulfites support sulfite to sulfate conversion. Source of sulfate to support sulfation, reduce glutamate and increase GABA, reduce histamine, reduce mTOR, support autophagy. So it's a shotgun approach, and clearly if you know exactly where the issue is, you'd be better off to go right there. But if you want a shotgun approach, here you go. So then I believe that before pushing NAD, it may be beneficial to calm NOX, then support pathways. There's an enzyme called QPRT, and when this is variated, the quinolinic acid doesn't go down the path. Quinolinic acid in excess is excitatory to the brain and also oxidizes your fats. People who have a lot of mutations in QPRT have a huge issue. As we know, NAD is a niacin. If someone's a huge undermethylator, you can have a flush. So you might need to support some methyl groups. Just a heads up, NQO1. This is on the Neuroinflammation Research Institute's top 10 variants that can cause problems for us. It's the NADH to NAD plus, and we spoke about that in the previous webinar. Paudiarco helps with that. So NAD plus NADPH assist does not have, interestingly, any nicotinamide mononucleotide or nicotinamide riboside, but it preps you so that everything is used properly, supports the production of the proper use of NAD. Then the H for NADPH, molecular hydrogen. Okay, so I'm a huge fan of molecular hydrogen. Tyler LeBaron and others have spoken about this extensively because it also regulates the body's antioxidant systems, including SOD and glutathione, converting the body's most harmful free radicals to water and supporting cell metabolism. And molecular hydrogen has the ability to neutralize and optimize the body's natural detox pathways. And look at this, inhibit the NOX enzyme responsible for oxidative stress. So when you're fighting a cold or the flu, might it be a good idea not to take this? Probably, because you want that burst. But otherwise, keeping that calm down because so many environmental factors are kicking it. It's one of my favorite supplements. Just me personally, I've often said if I was limited to do one thing and one thing only, it'd be molecular hydrogen. Okay. Then this is an interesting product called NMN Plus. It's got the nicotinamide mononucleotide plus some Paudiarco that supports the NADH to NAD plus and grapeseed extract to support QPRT. Again, I think this is unprecedented. So here you can see the Paudiarco, grapeseed extract, NMN, trimethylglycine. Okay, I believe this is the best way to take NMN so you don't get any of those negative side effects. So for those of you who are intrigued by this, and quite frankly, this is not for everybody. If somebody thinks that I'm going to run a genetic test and I'm going to get a one-page summary of what to do, no, this is for the person who really wants to dig, who's serious, wants to put time into it. So here's the Neuroinflammation Research Institute, where we do online education. Functional genomic analysis is the cloud-based software. We created our own chip called Your Genomic Resource that measures 200,000 SNPs. And then we just spoke about the functional genomic nutrition. We've also worked with professional health products. And then what we're really excited about, we're working with personalized nutrients. As you all know, when someone takes a supplement, you give someone a supplement, they'll look at it and say, oh, that's great, except, oh, I've had a negative reaction to fill in the blank. So if you really want to do personalized care, the functional genomic analysis software now supports you as the practitioner making your own supplement. But what we'll do is we'll take these formulas, put them in, give you the ability to remove or add, increase or decrease, put them all together. And I think as people get more complex, this is what we need to do. Clearly, wonderful supplement companies out there that make incredibly great products, but for some individuals, they can't handle it. For example, if COMT is really weak, you don't want to give any quercetin. So you might want to make a formula where you as the doctor take that out. If you'd like more information on that, we have it in the website. Here's the website to the Research Institute. Here is the online certification course. We're going to be upgrading that in April. The first 3 modules are free. You take a test after each one. You get a certification, and of course, this certification doesn't qualify you to do anything that you're not qualified to do. Anything you do with this has to be within your, legal scope of practice. This is just a certification course, nothing more than that. But for the person who wants to learn these things we talked about, we'll teach you those things. So yourgenomicresource.com, that's the site where even the layperson can go to learn about it. And then we have created our own DNA test. We used to use 23andMe until they went to version 5 and they dropped many of them. Trying to make this incredibly affordable. $199 for the saliva kit, $235 for buccal swab, includes the report generation. I mean, we have cut expenses and our margins to the as low as you can go to provide this. I mean, this is unprecedented in its price. Thermo Fisher makes the chip. It's run by by Brooks at Rutgers, and it gives you this huge report that works you through all these things. So here's the website, functionalgenomicanalysis.com. Yvonne Lucchese is our executive director. There's her phone number, 717-466-5700. Yvonne L at DNAsupplementation.com. If you are a practitioner, you can go here and request a free account, but you are going to have to, prove that you're a health professional. This is not one of these online things for anyone who wants to just run their DNA online, which can be dangerous because you can make some decisions that can actually work against you. So let's summarize. NAD+, critical for your DNA repair, feeds the sirtuins, feeds your NADPH, which is your energy, turns into NADPH, critical for so many functions. It's needed for nitric oxide, needed for heme to put your iron into ferritin. It's needed for recycling your glutathione, your thiodoxin, your nitric oxide. However, it's also used by the NOX enzyme to make superoxide and mast cells. Critical, gotta have it. But there's strong evidence that things from our environment that we weren't exposed to before is overusing it. You combine that, and then if someone also has weak production of NADPH, the proverbial perfect storm for these people can't detox. We've now done 7 studies and have our 8th abstract ready on Lyme disease. And we're seeing that many of these mutations that we talked about are much higher in those that have chronic Lyme. In other words, they, despite the best treatment by the best doctors, they can't seem to overcome it because they can't detox. So if you think this is something of interest to you, check us out. Again, not for the faint of heart. If you're looking for a 1-page summary that says do this, you're going to be disappointed and frustrated. But if you're willing to take the courses, do your homework, spend time on this, I believe this will give you insight that you never had before. Hoping to see you all at the EHS conference, whenever that happens to be. As of this recording, kind of up in the air as to what might happen. But whenever it does, we look forward to meeting you there where I'll be giving a presentation. So, Lynn, I think that'll wrap it up. So, any
Thank
final
you,
comments you
Bob.
have?
That was excellent, as always.